Migrating from UIKit to SwiftUI efficiently. With the advent of SwiftUI, there's a new paradigm, a paradigm shift to a different kind of UI. I have experience in migrating an app from around 60% Objective-C to about 4% Objective-C today. With that experience, it's helped me realize some things that I think will help with moving from UIKit to SwiftUI. And also, I've done much experimentation and planning with moving from UIKit to SwiftUI. And so today I'd like to talk about some of the things I've thought about, tested, planned, and elsewise. First, a self-introduction. My name is Joshua Kaplan, and I work at GMO Peppable on an app called Minne, which is the biggest handmade marketplace in Japan. My professional interests include CI/CD, frameworks, and more. My hobbies include making bread, studying history, and running. And if I get anything wrong in this presentation about SwiftUI, it's because I only have about a year of experience, so I apologize in advance. Today's talk will mostly cover these topics. First, why move to SwiftUI? I think most of you are already aware, but one of the biggest advantages with SwiftUI is that you can do more with less code for most things. Another is that many things are easier to implement. Things like dynamic text and other accessibility features, dark mode and light mode support, default layouts and margins for different compact sizes and screen rotations, etc. And finally, SwiftUI is the future of GUI, of GUI development on Apple platforms. Apple has been fairly clear. However, before I talk about migrating to SwiftUI, I have to cover why one might not want to move to SwiftUI, at least now. And that includes issues with stability. UIKit is very stable. SwiftUI is very new, and it has bugs. A lot of them seem to center around navigation, or just bugs that appear in different operating system versions. Another reason is lack of compatibility with older operating systems. For iOS, that means iOS 12 and lower, you can't use it. Another reason you might not migrate is you might have code that does very low-level things on the UI level and might have some high-performance needs that aren't covered by SwiftUI yet, or maybe they are, but they aren't super documented yet, and they might not be stable yet. Also, if you're focused on something big with your business, doing that at the same time as SwiftUI can be difficult. So mixing can be quite difficult, I think. Also, you have to take a look at how urgent it is. Do you need to focus on moving to SwiftUI now, or can you wait a little? That said, it is the future, so you should at least think about it and plan. The first thing you should do to prepare for SwiftUI is modernize your Swift usage. The most obvious thing of that being migrating from Objective-C. SwiftUI, as its name goes, is incompatible with Objective-C. You cannot write SwiftUI views with Objective-C. Another thing is it's good to use the latest version of Swift. Instead of migrating a bunch of different things at once, do it partially, bit by bit, and the Swift version is one of those things. Another thing is to make your code Swiftier. Much of your code might have been written in Objective-C or in a very UIKit-centric way, which is not necessarily Swifty, because UIKit is made by so much Objective-C. And Swiftier conventions can include things like value types, protocol-oriented programming, and functional programming. Next is get used to the latest features. Use them. You don't necessarily have to use them each and every place, and there's definitely a phenomenon of overuse. But it's good to know things like function builders and property wrappers that are essential for SwiftUI. The next is get familiar with functional reactive programming frameworks, the biggest of which are RxSwift, ReactiveSwift, and Combine. Next, modernize your UIKit usage. Even if you're not writing something in SwiftUI right now, it's good to use the very latest UIKit. That includes using auto layout, supporting safe area, and those are just two somewhat specific examples. Another thing is breaking up your views into more components. This will make things more reusable and allow you to do more partial migrations into SwiftUI. Another thing is make your storyboards thinner, or maybe consider not using them at all. You can use nibs instead. But having gigantic storyboards where you define all of your layout for a whole screen or even multiple screens can make things a little hard to reuse and be counter to breaking things up into components. Another thing is use modern APIs like that came about recently, like dynamic type and dark mode. And also another thing is use more declarative UIKit APIs where appropriate. In recent years, UIKit has had far more declarative APIs that save you a lot of work and make things very maintainable. Those include stack views, compositional layout, and diffable data sources. If you can't use them because you're targeting older OS versions, well, there are backport libraries that are pretty good. The next thing for migrating is planning and prototyping. Make a prototype and try to make that prototype in the same domain as your app. So in my case, my app is for buying and selling handmade items. So a general kind of e-commerce app that has a lot of requests, JSON requests to a backend server. Other apps might include document model ones, such as a note app, and etc. And while you're making your prototype, look at screens and components that are not suited to SwiftUI or that you might have some doubts about, and see if it's maybe a lack of knowledge that you have, or something lacking in SwiftUI, or even because SwiftUI is made to encourage the use of the human interface guidelines and Apple platform standards, maybe the design itself is not quite in touch with those, and maybe the design should be changed in some cases. Another way, it's kind of similar to prototyping, is to make an iOS 13 or whatever operating system you're targeting, newer one, is make a feature for only that operating system. Then you could try it out in a small scale way without maintaining two different implementations at the same time. Another very important thing to think about is architecture. There are some architectures that work better with UIKit and some architectures that work better with SwiftUI. And there are ways to kind of split the two to kind of balance between them. You should probably rethink your architecture, or not necessarily change your current architecture, but at least see how it works with SwiftUI. And even if it seems to work well, you might want to try out different GUI architectures to see if maybe there's one that works better. And making a prototype version of your app gives you a more small scale way to test them out. Some of the most common architectures that are said to work well with SwiftUI, and in my experience at least seem to, are Redux, the composable architecture, and MVVM. This could be a whole talk on its own. Next, the approach you should take in deciding which parts to change to SwiftUI. I think there are mostly two, and I'll give an example. Let's say your app is structured like this, very common. You have a tab bar controller as the root. For each tab, it has a navigation controller with a list or a grid. And then if you tap on an item in that list or grid, you go to some kind of detail view controller. Some people might try to start making the tab bar controller SwiftUI, or to start with the list view controller and try to make that SwiftUI. Especially if the list one seems like a simple thing in its appearance. If it's like a very simple table view, for example. But because, as you can see in this diagram, it's sandwiched between two different UIKit components, you have a lot of things to think about, and that could be very difficult. So I suggest the opposite of that approach, and generally sticking with screens that have fewer dependencies and are talking with fewer components. In this example, the detail view controllers. And then moving up from there. Do each detail separately, assuming they're different view controllers. Then do the list view controller. And then you can start embedding them in a navigation view and a tab bar view. And then finally, at the very end, change over your app delegate and your scene delegate. Next, I'd like to discuss some general tips. Don't mix too much on the same screen. It is possible to mix things, and the interop between UIKit and SwiftUI is very good. But the layout systems are very different. And because of that, you might have behavior that you don't expect, or it might pop up in some time you don't want. And I think it's just easier to try to move one screen to SwiftUI at a time. Of course, your commits can be component by component, and that probably works well. Next is start with easier screens. SwiftUI is particularly good at reducing verbose code in screens with grids or lists, or also forms. It has a great component for forms, and forms usually require a lot of custom code and logic in UIKit. Another thing is don't hurry. Apple hasn't said they'll deprecate UIKit tomorrow. They haven't given a deadline. They haven't, as far as I know, said anything clear about that. In the next few years, I don't think they'll do it right away. Look at Objective-C and Swift. Objective-C you can still use. You should probably move on if you can, in many cases. But it's not deprecated all of a sudden, because Apple itself has a lot of code. Another thing, and this is fairly obvious, I think, but is it's good to study SwiftUI and Combine in advance before you try to write production code. Study while you prototype, study before you prototype, because If you try to study SwiftUI and combine while working on production code, you'll only be focusing on the code you're writing in that moment, and you might not realize the larger details that might be really important. At the end of my slides, there's some reference materials, recommended books, and links to documentation you can use. In conclusion, modernize your Swift usage. This could always be more modern. Modernize your UIKit usage. Write plans where you're gonna list up screens that you think might be easier to move on first, or new features you might want to try that are only for iOS 13, for example. And prototype. Try different things out. How do I make this screen? How do I make that? How will data flow work? How will these interoperate? For your prototype, you can make it partially UIKit, partially SwiftUI. Think of the two approaches, starting near the root view controller and starting as far away as possible. I recommend starting far away from the root as possible in most cases. There might be some exceptions I haven't thought of. But by preparing to move to SwiftUI in advance and thinking about these things, your actual migration will be more efficient. You'll be able to write higher quality code. And so I hope this presentation has been useful. Thanks to SwiftUI, our jobs will probably get easier. And with that anticipation, I hope we all look forward to it and we have a lot of fun along the way. Thank you very much.